All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture, which is part 2 of critiquing the social contract. So if you have not watched part 1, make sure you go back and watch it so that way this lecture will make sense to you, because we are now going to delve into the weeds of the social contract, and we're going to unpack some very intricate things because it's going to help us to understand why some folks may act the way they act and do the things that they do by way of understanding the social contract. But none of that will make sense if you don't really have that foundation for part 1, right? So for this lecture, you were supposed to read pages 9 through 19. So make sure you go back and do that if you have not done it already, right? Or pause this video, go read it, and then come back and watch, right? So what are we going to be looking at? What's our roadmap? We're going to look at key terms. We're going to go back to the Declaration. We're going to talk about the requirements of the social contract. And then we're going to talk about the composition of the racial contract. So let's look at some key terms from our previous lecture. And I'm going to introduce you to a new term that you should be aware of. First, we're going to start with the state of nature. As a reminder, the state of nature is just simply one's location in society before the formation of government and agreed upon rules. The social contract, on the other hand, is a socio-political agreement which moves an individual from the state of nature to a, quote, civilized state via the creation of a centralized government. However, in order to get to the social contract, what Charles Mills is arguing in this text is that a racial contract exists. And what is a racial contract according to Charles Mills? He is saying that a racial contract is the racialized socio-political agreement which serves as a supporting substructure and or collateral upon which the social contract itself is established. In other words, that the racial contract has to exist before the social contract comes into being. Now, what is a new term that you should be familiar with? Or that you need to be familiar with, rather, that is epistemology. And that is simply a word that means the study of knowledge, or how we come to know what we know and how that knowledge in turn helps us to understand the world around us and interpret the world around us. So let's go ahead and get started. This lecture won't be that long per se, because we're just delving into the weeds and providing some nuance so that when we get to Cheryl Harris's whiteness as property for the next lecture, things make sense. So let's go back to this moment with the Declaration of Independence, and I want you to look at this picture. I want you to observe who is there, who is not there. What does this picture imply? What has to be true in order for this picture to be a reality? What are they doing in this picture? And as you're thinking through those things, I want you to think about what Charles Mills stated on page 13 of the text. He says this, he says, quote, "The establishment of society thus implies the denial that a society already existed. The creation of modern society requires the intervention of white men who are thereby positioned as already socio-political beings." Let's unpack this moment. What is Charles Mills getting at? That in order for this picture, this illustration, this painting to exist, that is depicting the signing and the negotiation of the Declaration of Independence, that societies that were there, their existence had to be denied. Which societies? Those who were indigenous and native to the land. Those who were enslaved and forced across the Atlantic from continental Africa. Right? Those lands that were colonized upon that are in Central and South America, etc. Right? That those societies had to be interpreted and seen as not existing, that their very existence, their importance, the substance of those society had to be denied in order for this moment, this depicted moment, to take place. That is what Charles Mills is getting at. He's really getting at a psychology here. That those who are assembled in the room negotiating the Declaration and signing the Declaration had to intentionally not see those populations as viable, as having meaningful contributions to world history in order for them to facilitate this moment. He then goes on to say the creation of society, and I'm going to say modern society, requires the intervention of this particular demographic who are thereby positioned as already socio-political beings. In other words, before they can even come into the room, negotiate the declaration, sign the declaration, even have conversations around it, etc. And as you can see, some of the men in the picture are paying attention, some of the men in the picture are not paying attention, because there is an assumption that I'm going to be good either way. But before they can even step to the table to negotiate, to write out, to enact, that they see themselves as superior socio-political beings who have the authority to bring the society into being over and above existing societies, native and indigenous peoples that are already present. Right? This is what Charles Mills is getting at. This is what he means by unpacking the social contract and understanding that the social contract, which is the moment that's depicted here, is informed by and undergirded by the racial contract. Because before they can even have this moment, they have to see themselves and understand themselves as socio-political beings who are allowed to bring this nation state into being over and above the lives of those indigenous and native persons, as well as those who are enslaved, that they already see themselves as superior to. Charles Mills is saying that is what this historical moment is all about, and helps us to understand the social contract further. So, along those lines, if this moment is about establishing the social contract, what then does the social contract require of those who are both signatories to it and benefactors of it? Right? Let's move to requirements of the social contract. And this is all in pages 9 through 19. What is Charles Mills leading us into here? What becomes necessary in order for the contract to be affected, right? And how does this translate to the present predicament of society, the contemporary context? He says a few things. The first things being that the status of those who are included, excluded, indoor, allowed, disallowed, as someone said in their comments and feedback and questions this past week, that those who are included, excluded, allowed, and disallowed be clearly demarcated by law or custom. In other words, de jure or de facto. You should remember those terms from the first lecture. And what he is saying here is that in order for this moment to take place, in order for the declaration and other laws, to come into place, there has to be a clear demarcation between who is privileged by such documents and laws and who is not privileged by such document and laws, and that clear distinction be made by way of law itself, de jure, or by custom, de facto. This is where you get folks who follows people who they perceive should not be in their neighborhood. What are you doing here? Where do you belong? Etc. That the social location of persons be clearly identified and demarcated, whether it be by law or by custom. And those persons have no right to do so, but they are doing so by custom because that is what the social contract requires. That folks inherently understand the contract and they perform their contractual duties so that they can continue to be benefactors of the contract. Y'all picking up what I'm putting down here? But what else is required? Charles Mills says in the text in pages 9 through 19 that self-transparency and social realities are necessarily precluded. In other words, really seeing oneself for who oneself is, and seeing society and social beings in reality has to be precluded. That one has to see oneself as superior in order to affect this contract, in order to ascribe to whiteness, right? That self-transparency is prevented, and that seeing society for what it actually is has to be prevented in order to be a signatory or benefactor of the contract. That one is not allowed to be transparent with oneself in understanding that nations like Europe were late to world history. That a lot of the inventions that are credited to Europe came before Europe. But that level of self-transparency is not permitted, right? That the idea of a nation state is not a creation or a technology of Western philosophy. That there were nation states way before, Greece and Rome and all of these other different nations came about, right? But that this type of self-transparency, this type of social reality is prevented. That reality check has to be prevented in order for one to ascribe to the social contract. What else has to be there? Charles Mills says that white misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and self-deception is necessary for the preservation of the nation-state project. In other words, that in this moment, what is in this room is misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and self-deception, a deception of the self. And these particular things are necessary not only to create and to bring into being the nation state, but also to preserve the project of the nation state. Think about this. The type of psychological processes that had to have taken place in this room in order to bring the nation state into being. What else is Charles Mills saying is required in the contract? And again, now we're getting into the weeds of the social contract. Now that we understand it, now we're getting down into the critique part of it, right? Going back to the critical part of critical race theory. Now we're getting into the weeds of it. And Charles Mills says that in order for the requirement to be fulfilled, in order for benefactors to demonstrate that they understand the contract, another requirement is to intentionally misinterpret the world. That an inverted epistemology, an inverted way of knowing, an inverted way of understanding is required. It is an intentional epistemology of ignorance. This is what he says, that it is intentional. It is not happenstance that one looks upon the world and misinterprets the world. So one can look at the Panama Canal and say, we're taking that back over because it's ours. That is an intentional misinterpretation of the world. I'm taking over Iceland, an intentional misinterpretation of the world. I'm going to place troops at the border and potentially run into this nation. These are claims that are being made. An intentional misinterpretation of the world. An inverted epistemology that says to one that I can take over these spaces. Because one already sees themselves as, what did Charles Mills say? An already socio-political being. Because you do not see a society as already existing in that area of the world who has their own independent government, rules, laws, customs, etc. And he's saying that this intentional misinterpretation, the inverted epistemology, an epistemology of intentional ignorance is required for both the signatories and the benefactors. In other words, the posterity of those, the lineage of those who come after the signatories. In other words, this stuff is taught. It is socialized. How does one come to say that they're going to take over the Panama Canal and different territories if it had not been previously taught by successive generations? How does one see oneself as being able to conquer, take over, to colonize, or think they have a right to do so if it had not been taught? This is the importance of the social contract. This is the importance of the racial contract, and reading it and understanding what Charles Mills is laying out. But Charles Mills says also that an inverted, delusional worldview, a racial fantasy land, a consensual hallucination is required. That's on page 18, by the way. That these things are prerequisites in order to look out on the world and interpret the world in that way. Sit with this for a minute. This is why, again, that CRT is not taught at the K through 12 level, because there are so many things and so many disciplines that have to be understood. Not only how society comes to be society and socialization, different things of that sort, but clearly we are in the realm of psychology here. Clearly we are dealing with understandings of the self. Clearly we are dealing with issues of hallucination and delusion and different things of that sort. And that one has to move one's cognitive faculties to a very specific place in order to enact the contract. This is what Charles Mills is getting at. That we are all caught up in the collective delusion of a specified demographic because they see themselves as above and beyond via what the contract, the social contract requires, because that social contract rests upon a type of collateral, the racial contract, that presents those who are non-white, right, as unequal to those who are white, and that inequality, that specific inequality, is seen as equal. Sit with that for a moment. What else does Charles Mills say in his text? And this is on page 11. He says that all white persons are beneficiaries of the contract, though most are not signatories. What does this look like in everyday practice? You can be a person who looks like me, who's degreed up, right? You could be middle class to upwardly mobile, right? And someone who is of working class, who does not look like you, can see themselves as above you because they have retained whiteness as a type of property that gives them their wealth and their value. And what Charles Mills is saying is that is a type of psychology and cognitive processing that we need to unpack and understand. That one understands that to understand oneself through one's racialized identity is a type of psychology that needs to be unpacked and fully understood, but at the same time further retrenches and reifies the social contract. And this is why we're moving to what next week? Whiteness is property, so that we understand it. And this is how they come to be beneficiaries, though not signatories. Furthermore, this is how loans come to be approved. This is how one can be Secretary of Defense and have no experience. This is why one can be given wide authority over the health of a nation, yet have no experience. Yet people of color black people and people of color who served in those positions have to have all the experience in the world and then some. Because not only are they not signatories, they are also not beneficiaries of the social contract that rests upon the racial contract. I hope this is hitting home and making sense, right? Lastly, let's look at the composition of the racial contract. And again, we're just going into the weeds here so that we can tease it out and really speak to how CRT helps us to understand the moment, right? So what is the composition of the racial contract now that we have pulled that together, right? What is this that's underlying the social contract? Charles Mills says this, that it is political, moral, epistemological, and real. What does that mean? That to say that the racial contract is political, it means that it not only established society in government, that this moment established society in government, but it also determined who got what, when they get it, where they get it, how they get it, and why they get it. And that the why is in most instances predicated upon one's demographic belonging. Moreover, Charles Mills says not only is the racial contract political, it is also moral. That it establishes the laws which regulate the behavior of individuals in society as well as social norms. That to follow one in the store now becomes a societal norm. That to assume the guilt of one becomes a societal norm. Do you all understand what's being put down here? That by way of the racial contract, the inequities that are experienced in society are intentional. They're not like, just happenstance and oops, the law slipped up. No, this is the way that it is constructed. This is what the racial contract is getting at, that informs the social contract, such that when we read and interpret and imply laws, right? This reminds me of Latasha Harlins immediately comes to mind. And the judge in that case in the 90s. Here is a wonderful book that you should check out by Brenda Stevens. And in this book, she recalls where the judge looks at Soon Jadu, who unalived Latasha Harlins, right? And she essentially lets her off, and she's saying, I understand what a good mother looks like. The implication of that being that Latasha Harlins' mother wasn't a good mother, because I understand what a bad mother looks like. More to say about that when we get to the feminism part of this. But being able to interpret the law in that way and to set a norm. By the way, this is foreshadowing what we're going to be distinguishing coming for the future, especially for our last lecture. But that establishing laws which regulate this kind of behavior of individuals in society and setting those social norms is the standard. This is why understanding the social contract and the racial contract is important. And he also says that the racial contract is epistemological. It determines what is and is not. Who is seen as equal? Who is seen as barbaric? Who is seen as potentially a threat? Who is seen as not potentially a threat? Who is seen as innocent? Who is seen as not innocent? How does this interpret into everyday life? When you go to work and you can do one thing and not get away with it, but if somebody else does that same thing who doesn't look like you, guess what happens? And so it becomes the work of allies to intervene in that moment and say, oh, no, you misinterpreted that moment. Because what are they doing in that moment? They're abiding by the social contract because they seek to misunderstand, misrepresent. It is a self-deception and misinterpreting the world. It is an inverted epistemology at that time. What is another example of this? Claims of reverse racism. Because claims of reverse racism implies that you understand that the default setting of the world in which we currently reside is what? Racism. But to reverse that, which is not possible, you don't want to experience it. So that means that you understand that the epistemological arrangement that comes about by way of the social contract has inherently misaligned the world. And how has it misaligned the world? Charles Mills says that the racial contract allows it to become real because it impacts life's outcomes. Think about health outcomes, right? That it impacts life outcomes and the distribution of resources down to schools. That is why this Hillman Talk moment is so important, making education free and accessible. Because there has been an intentional distribution of resources that have not allowed students of color to access this knowledge at this depth. That impacting life outcomes as far as food deserts, economic equality, when we deal with social mismatch, what is that? Or spatial mismatch, what is that? That is when your job is over here, but you live all the way over here. And that primarily impacts non-white persons. That this is the composition of the collateral that undergirds the social contract, so that by the time we get to the Declaration of Independence and unpack and understand its words, which we did in the previous lecture, then things begin to come clear and we understand why society is the way it is. With that stated, that is today's lecture. And hopefully this helps you to understand Charles Mills's text more as you go into it. Take your time, read line by line, word by word, so that you can unpack it, right? And it helps us to understand where society is at and why we are experiencing what we are experiencing. Because demands have been made on the social contract, which in turn itself is backed by the racial contract. I'll see you all next time. Peace.